Welcome to Season 3 of Maxwell En-Route. As we stepped into 2025, we'll explore the theme Balancing Sustainability and Progress. Guided by our host, Junian Ban, our first guest, Professor Benjamin Horton, a leading scientist expert in climate change research, will discuss the urgency of the climate crisis and the path forward.
Okay, welcome to another episode of Maxwell En-Route, our podcast. And this season is going to be a really fun and interesting one. Fun from a podcast point of view, but the content, the topic is really dead serious. And today we have with us Professor Ben Horton. Professor Horton is actually, right now, he is the director of the Earth Observatory of Singapore at Nanyang Technological University. And he was also previously President's Chair in Earth Sciences. But his list of accolades and awards is really long, and I think we're going to spend the next 20 minutes just going through the list. He's received Plinius Medal from the European Geosciences Union, the Voyager Award from the American Geophysical Union, the W. Storrs Cole Award from the Geological Society of America. He was elected Fellow of the Geological Society of America in 2013, Fellow of the American Geophysical Union in 2016. He is author of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, the 5th Assessment Report, and is a review editor for the new 6th Assessment Report. His research was cited by President Obama in the State of Union Address in 2015. And he's published over 220 articles. And now we have the pleasure of listening to him talk about this. And I want to just start off saying, welcome. Thank you for joining us today. Can I just call you Ben?
Oh, of course you can call me Ben.
Ben, all right. Yeah. So can you tell us a bit more, first of all, of your own journey, as in how do you find yourself doing this? Was it something you always wanted, or did something along the way sort of draw you towards climate science and earth sciences?
I mean, anybody's career is always a series of pivot points that brings you to me sitting here talking to you today about the most important problem that's ever faced society,
right,
which is addressing this climate emergency. But when I was in my early 20s and I decided I wanted a career in science, all I wanted to do was make sure that my science was relevant because my science is paid for by taxpayers' dollars.
Right.
So whether when I did my PhD and postdoc in the UK, or I was an early career researcher in the United States, or now in Singapore, I think it's very important for science to be relevant. I think it's very important that you are able to communicate your science to different stakeholders, be they your funders in terms of the government, be they school children, be they the everyday worker, be they students.
Right.
So I've always thought about that. And, as a scientist, I got involved in studying in my PhD how the coastlines change through time,
right,
which has a relationship to climate. But there were two, I would say, sliding doors moments for me. The first one was when I moved to the United States. Quite soon after, Al Gore released his documentary film,
right,
Inconvenient Truth.
Yeah.
And that took climate change from being a topic that was discussed by scientists, discussed within policy, but then took it into the mainstream. And therefore, there was a need for scientists to be willing to talk to the public. And that's where I thought I had a role. I was at a very good university, the University of Pennsylvania, and in Penn, they very much like the scientists to talk to the public in the local communities, the regional communities, nationally, and because of Penn's prestige globally. So I found that I was able to do that, and I was always interested in how to develop the communication message to get the information across. The second aspect regards your own individual science. Maybe some 10 to 15 years or so ago, we started to develop techniques which meant that data far beyond the observational record of the 20th and 21st century of climate could be collected in a means that it was accurate enough to calibrate climate models.
Okay.
And so we produced a paper that was in the National Academy of Sciences, which said this very strong statement that the rates of sea level rise in the 20th and the 21st century were faster than anything that had been experienced in the previous 2,000 years.
Right.
Now, that sort of statement is very important for climate change. It shows we're living in an unusual time. And it was such an important statement that, as you said earlier, President Obama in 2015 used it in his State of Union address. Now, normally a president would turn to the National Ocean Atmospheric Administration or NASA, but in this case, they came to our research group and our paper.
Right.
So that then elevated my own individual science, as well as being a topic that has been of national relevance. And I've just continued that. And I think that communicating the threat of climate change is more important now than it ever has been. And I feel as though it is sort of my mission in my life right now is to communicate this whenever and wherever I can. Every day that I wake up, I try and find an angle to appeal to a different type of person to hopefully get them to realize that climate change is deadly serious, but also that we have hope and we have choices. And that's why I'm here today.
No, that's fantastic. In fact, you touched on something which I thought was interesting about communicating to people. One of the things I realized is that when a message is a bit too abstract, when we quote numbers, or like when someone says, "Oh, this nearest star is how many billion miles away," we have no way of understanding the scale of that. It's just a number, and you add 5 more zeros to it, it means the same thing to the person. So when we tell them that, temperatures are going to rise by half a degree or a degree in X number of years, it doesn't mean anything because people are like, well, on a given day, the temperature fluctuates by 2 degrees, so who cares? But when that translates into things that they can begin to understand, like storms being stronger or waves that hit you or, parts of your city being totally submerged, then I think people begin to say, oh, okay, now it's no longer just about a half a degree temperature rise, but there are actual serious consequences on all of us. So in that vein, I'm just wondering, could you just give us a sense of what, on our current rate of global warming, what the world would look like in 20 years, and specifically for Singapore, what danger does the current rate of climate change hold for an island nation like Singapore?
If you want to downscale it to Singapore, for the next 30 years, if we reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, what will happen to Singapore is it will still get warmer and there will be more heat waves and our national temperature records will be broken again and again. And as residents of Singapore, we're going to have to think about spending more and more hours in air conditioning. We're going to have to think about making sure that we have heat warmings and that we can hydrate, particularly those people who are young, elderly or infirm. That's not going to change.
Right.
As we go through the next 30 years in Singapore, it's going to get wetter. There are going to be more torrential rainfalls.
Okay.
And therefore, areas of Singapore are going to flood. So again, we need to be more aware of that. And then finally, over the next 20 or 30 years, there'll be more sea level rise. The ice caps will continue to melt in Greenland and Antarctica. And Singapore will continue to have significant problems in terms of importing food, in terms of water resources, and in terms of protecting this island.
Right.
And that's a fact. It's not going to change. There's nothing you can do about it. But hotter climates, wetter climates, rising sea level, when it's relatively gradual, if we invest the resources, we can adapt. And Singapore can continue to prosper. And your kids and your loved ones can continue to have a sustainable life where their livelihood is not bounded by climate change. But if society doesn't mitigate against greenhouse gases, the rate of temperature will be so great that Singapore outside temperatures will be outside the limits of human survival.
Interesting.
Sea level rise will be so great. Singapore, about a third of Singapore's island, is less than the height of this table above highest of high tides. The Antarctic ice sheet has 65 metres of sea level rise, about 20 floors of one of the skyscrapers here. So what do you think is going to happen to Singapore? And I have been here and I've loved working in Singapore. It's my home. You know, like something very personal to me. On November the 16th, I'm getting married in Singapore. In Singapore.
Right.
Okay? So it's my home on a very personal basis. And so I want to save this country. And what I implore people who are listening to this podcast, make the change. Save your country because it's my country as well now.
Congratulations on the upcoming wedding.
I'm exceedly
No, but that's fantastic because it gives us a good foundation for the next question, which is what precisely do the various parts of Singapore need to do? Like, what does the individual need to do? What do corporations need to do? What does the government need to do? In your opinion, again, whether they want to, whether they can, that's a separate question. But I think it's worth asking, in that ideal scenario, this is what you ought to do, at least for Singapore. We can't speak for the rest of the world yet.
Well, the individual doesn't really need to do much more. One of the big problems with climate change, one of the big sort of miscommunications is that it's your problem and you solve it. It's not. The individual has now been educated that climate change is a problem. The recent survey coming out of NUS that said that some 60% of people in Asia believe that climate change is going to significantly influence their lives in the next 10 years. People in Singapore and Southeast Asia also know what the threats of climate change are: the rising sea levels, heat waves, floods, landslides. Mm-hmm. People in Southeast Asia, over 70% of them are changing their use of plastics. 60% of them are reducing their energy to save carbon. And 50% of them are changing their lifestyles. For example, how they commute to work. Indeed, of the respondents that are aware of climate change, over 80% of them in Asia are willing to foot the bill of a carbon tax. So the individual, yes, we could educate them more and we could say, look, here are the real problems. But the gap, even though 70% in Asia, but globally, the average is around 70 to 80% want their governments to do more. The governments don't. Okay? So the governments and big business don't do enough. You elect your officials to look after your life. The biggest threat is not the geopolitical balance in the world. The biggest threat isn't an inflation crisis. The biggest threat is not another pandemic. The biggest threat to everyone's life on planet Earth is climate change. So what an individual, I would say, should do, and much of the world is in an election year, and Singapore's will be early next year, is ask your elected officials, what are you doing about climate? Ask your elected official in Badok, how are you going to cool my community? It's getting too hot. How are you going to cool it? My commute to work is being affected because it's raining so much. How are you going to ask the elected official? Because if they're not being asked that question, then they will continue to ignore it.
No, I mean, that's exactly what I was actually getting at, because I think that you pointed out correctly that the individual is already doing a lot. I think that's the part that's missing, where people are not realizing that there's this disconnect between what you're convicted about and what you're prepared to do on a daily basis, and what it translates into when you're actually at the ballot box. Because at the end of the day, the politicians are still sort of looking at it as, okay, you want jobs, you want safety, you want, good economic prospects. Climate change, it's too far down for some of them.
But it's not. You see, that's the whole thing about, so I feel as though, for people of influence, it's not sufficient to just understand that climate change is happening or realize it's due to human activity. And the vast majority of people will be aware of that. You can only see that in front of your very eyes. In Singapore, we know that over the last 18 months, it has been really hot.
Yeah.
When the sun shines and it's a cloudless sky, it's hot out there in the afternoon. It's quite dangerous, okay? But really understanding the impact. So, in a conversation, a very frustrating conversation I had last week, where people were saying, well, population is the problem, not climate change, because we're just going to have more and more people on planet Earth, and they're all going to require carbon. And I went, now population is irrelevant, because if you don't solve climate change, people will die in their hundreds of millions, because the Earth can't sustain 8 million, 5 million, 3 billion people on planet Earth. Then there was another argument, well, what about the expansion of the middle classes? That's going to happen in the next 30 years. What expansion of the middle classes? If you don't solve climate change, there is no jobs, there is no economy, there's place to live. Singapore, as I said, a third of Europe, where is, so one of the arguments is, maybe we should limit Singapore's population. Why are we even thinking about that? When you think about things, economy, jobs, safety, health, education, they are down the list. Climate is the number one. Without a healthy planet, you cannot have a healthy economy. And we have to realize that. And what my wish, if you asked me, what would I want to happen? I would want to see that a president's or a prime minister's right-hand person was not an economist, a lawyer. It was a climate scientist. A climate scientist. Not someone who is interested in climate, not someone who understands that this is a problem, someone who has spent their career studying it.
Yeah, no, I think that conversation that you're referring to last week is really odd, because I guess it reflects either ignorance on the part of some of the individuals, or there's a hidden agenda to try to not talk about things, because it sounds a lot like people who are arguing over a drink that got spilled in your car seat while the car is barreling off a cliff. It feels like that, where you're like, dude, who cares about the drink? Watch the road.
Yeah.
So I think that's the problem. How is it that we have people in that position who clearly are intelligent, I assume, and as you point out, the facts have been with us for a long time, but why is it not quite resonating as something that you need to do? Like, an example, I suppose, would be human nature in the case of exercise and healthy living as individuals. I think that a lot of people would definitely fall into the category of people who have access to information about nutrition and exercise and whatever, and they still don't do anything about it for themselves until a crisis hits. Like, oh, you've been diagnosed with like high blood pressure or diabetes or something, and then you're like, crap, I need to quit this, I need to stop that. Is this actually sort of like the story of human nature, that the actual facts might be in front of us, and we don't do anything until it's serious?
Yes and no, but so the messaging on prevention in health through exercise or healthy living has been made for many years. What you don't have is a very high-powered, very, very affluent lobbying group saying the opposite. There are very, very powerful lobbying groups who are incredibly successful. For example, how does the Conference of Parties, the COP meetings that are there to find solutions to the climate crisis, why are they in oil states? Why were they in Dubai and why are they in Azerbaijan? Shows how powerful they are. So how can you compete against that? It's really difficult. So, like if we look at the history of climate change, the science has been solid. It has got better and better. Of course it would be with technological evolution, with more and more powerful computing models, better observations, remote sensing, all of those type of things. But the lobbying has always been there, and there's always a different aspect. First of all, if you look at the history of it, the oil and petroleum groups had the best possible information on climate change. They knew about it. It's their product.
Right.
It's their product. So of course they know the impact of burning fossil fuels. And if you were in the 70s or 80s and you wanted to run a workshop on the future of Earth's climate, you'd ask somebody from Chevron or Shell or BP to talk because they had the best possible models. But beginning in the 1990s, those oil industries went on a process of misinformation to the public because they saw that their bottom line could be influenced by a decision of the public, a decision of governments, and then the private sector would follow of moving towards sustainability and renewable energy.
Right.
So there has been this problem that, and then I would also say that, sometimes scientists are their worst enemies. We're not exactly the greatest communicators. We live quite often in a little bubble. And universities, where a lot of this research and development on climate change, it's not in their best interest of the individual within the university to communicate on science, because you have to be aware that the promotion and tenure, so to get a job in a university, then to be promoted within a university, is based upon publications.
Right.
In these peer-reviewed journals that are read by other scientists.
Right.
Like my father is an academic, okay? So my father's an academic, and I said to him, I'd like to be a scientist as well, Dad. And he said, well, you do know your career will be based around writing these obscure papers, wanting somebody you've never met somewhere else in the world to read them. And that's your career. And I went, really? He said, yeah. That's your career. And that's how universities run. But
here you are.
And so you can break the mold, but it's very difficult. So
Right.
you've got public and private sector and universities, and in some ways they're all mutually exclusive. And what we need to do is bring them all together and make everyone realize that climate change needs to be answered. And we need to be aware, as I said earlier, it's going to get warmer, it's going to get wetter, and sea levels. So we desperately need to make our regions more resilient. We've had many, many programs and much information about greening cities and making cities resilient. And we've quite simply failed on that. We can just look at the news, and when we have a large-scale hazard in terms of a heat wave or a typhoon or a hurricane, we see a lack of resilience, and then it becomes a disaster. We hardly ever see these examples, there was a hazard, but Dubai was able to stop the record rainfall from shutting the airport, or the typhoon came in and the nature-based solutions dissipated the energy and the area didn't flood. There was a heat wave, but we had cooled the city to make sure that the residents were safe. We don't hear about that. What we hear is that there's a hazard and then there's a humanitarian disaster. And we need to break that. And the elected officials, and I keep going back, the MP from Badok needs to have a plan in place for when the next heat wave comes to that region of how they're going to make sure that people are safe. And then they need to have a medium and long-term solution of how they're going to cool that community. That's what has to happen. We have to break that. And then we have to understand the urgency of this. And then the other aspect that, so frustration, it's not despair. I don't despair about climate change because we have all the solutions, okay? So it's just frustration because we're going like, well, I know what will happen. And, I have kids and I want them, I'm a parent and the most important thing in my life is the health and happiness. That's why you become a parent. Health and happiness of your kids. Mm-hmm. And I know that if society doesn't do anything about climate change, they won't be healthy and they won't be happy. And I'm so frustrated because all the solutions are out there.
But I wonder where this now, because when we touch on things like the powerful lobbies, big oil, corporates that are responsible for a disproportionate amount of the pollution and so on, the consumption of energy. Is this actually a rich-poor divide problem where the people who are most affected are the poorer people, the people who can't uproot and move to a nicer part of town, who live at a coastline, who rely on the sea for their livelihoods and so on, farmers and so on, and the people who directly stand to gain from the continuing growth of the economies, the sale of oil and the sale of all the products that consume energy. These people who are behind the lobbyists, who are in the, they have the ear of the government and so on, these people have no interest in dealing with this problem because there is a direct current benefit to them and they possess the means to adapt to future changes, whereas the people who don't stand to gain from this and are most affected by climate change belong to a group that maybe have less influence, less power, unless you really talk about uprisings in the street and so on. I wonder whether that's part of the complication where people know, but some people benefit from the status quo more than others.
Well, I mean, again, you're asking my opinion on something I'm passionate about, but I'm not an expert about, which is behavioural change. I'm a physical climate scientist. Mm-hmm. I know how the Earth system works, and what petrifies me is that I've been spending 25 years on this, and I always say that if you knew what I knew, you'd be very scared of this future unless we change how we derive our energy and how we live our lifestyles. But going back to your question, I mean, my thoughts about that are twofold. Of course, you're exactly right that, the rich 1% of planet Earth produce more carbon than the poorest 50%. I mean, it's like so uneven. But that's also a huge advantage. It means that you don't actually need to change the lives and livelihoods of every single person on planet Earth. Mm-hmm. You know exactly who the polluters are, mm-hmm. and you know how to solve it. It's a very small segment of the Earth's general population that can significantly make a difference. That's the aspect about it. Climate change will, if we just think generally, will impact our cities before it impacts the rural areas. So change our cities. Singapore is a country that is a city.
Right.
All right. I mean, you say that, the poorest people have nowhere to run. Well, in Singapore, you've got nowhere to run. I am very aware. I mean, I've worked all over the world, and I state that of all the developed nations, Singapore is the most susceptible of anyone on planet Earth. You've got nowhere to run. So if I walk out of Maxwell today and I want to escape to somewhere cool, can you give me advice where I would go in Singapore to do that? Okay. I want to move my house to somewhere in high ground. Can you tell me where I could go? No, you've got nowhere.
Marina Bay Sands probably right up.
Well, how would you get in? How would you get in the front door?
Well, I think that's why they build it as a boat right at the top for rising sea levels.
Forward planning, huh? But I mean,
it's a fair point. It's a fair point, and I think the message here is that Singapore is extremely vulnerable to climate change, and we are also a country with resources that can either entirely go to adaptation, or can we do more to be a role model for the rest of the world?
I also think that if you want to be a game changer, if you want to be leading in the field, then why not lead in adaptation and green technology? Singapore, again, one of the problems with climate change is that a lot of the research and a lot of the solutions has been developed in the global north, been developed for North America and developed for Europe, and that doesn't particularly work in the tropics. Now, Singapore has, and I always think about this in terms of university, has 2 world-class universities, has many great universities, but if you look at rankings, it's got NUS and NTU, and they're in the top 30 in the world, okay? See, I always think that Singapore should be more proud of, you've got 2 universities in the top 30 in the world. What 2 companies, Singapore companies, are in the top 100, 500? You've got 2 universities. They compete now with Caltech, MIT, Potsdam, Imperial, Oxford, Cambridge.
Right.
They're in that echelon. And you've got a responsibility because in the tropics, there's no other world-class university. So the research and the solutions, the R&D that you do within Singapore can then be used for the tropics. And and if we want to go back to, well, if we solve climate, then there will be an economy and there will be growth. And if you've got an economy and growth, then you're creating the social capital for your education and your welfare. Solve climate, and just the trickle-down effect of this will blow your mind. But carry on regardless, and Singapore gets too hot and it floods and it disappears. And I do believe that Singapore can lead. I mean, the inspiration that I drive is from, the students and the early career researchers that work at NTU. I mean, they're phenomenal. They are becoming increasingly frustrated. So again, if you want to, why should Singapore do this? Well, Singapore should lead because it's got all these young people who are looking to people within, they're in their teens or they're in their early 20s. They can't make the influence in big business or in government for decades.
Right.
It's up to us to do it.
Fair enough.
So if you want to say, why should we do it? We only contribute 0.1%. Well, give me a break. What about those young people? Do you not care about them?
Yeah. No, I think that's...
It's just like, I always go like, what? Again, so you may be asking the wrong person these questions, because from my angle, I always go like, well, what more do you need to know? But maybe we haven't communicated it properly. We haven't driven home how it will really influence your bank account, so the financial impacts. There won't be the jobs in Singapore,
right? Yeah.
Any jobs without climate change. We haven't driven home the health impacts. So the solution to climate change is not going out for a run at 6 p.m. You won't be able to go out for a run because it's too goddamn hot, or the area you're running is underwater. So you have to. So I think that there is an error that climate scientists for a long time have thought, well, we'll just produce these reports and that people will read them and that governments will react, rather than realizing that there are other elements in society that don't want that change. And so what you need to do is get everyone on your side, so we drown out those voices.
Right, exactly. I mean, I don't think it's fair for the climate scientists to also be the advocates. I think it has to be a much wider body of people that advocate for this based on the work of the climate scientists. I think that's the right model. Actually, Ben, I have a question for you that regarding this idea of an individual. Maybe it's not about meeting a person who could change the world or going back in time and changing something in the past. But what if there was a person who had already got influence in the world today? Wouldn't that person being alive to this issue and being a bit of a spokesperson about it, wouldn't that be great?
Yeah, I mean, I've been asked this before, and I gave it some thought, and I said, well, if there's one person on planet Earth that seems to have the sway of millions of people, it's Taylor Swift. So I've always thought that if I could have one wish, it would be for Taylor Swift to not fall in love with an American football player, but to fall in love with a climate scientist and use her power and her influence. She's a person who, has got involved in American democracy. Donald Trump says he hates her. So she obviously moves the needle.
Right.
So why not on climate change? Instead of writing songs
of
breakups, write songs about the breakup of planet Earth.
No, that would be fantastic to listen to.
But I'm taken because I'm getting married next month. So I'm taken, but there are many others that I think would take the call.
So the next time Taylor has a concert in Singapore, we'll make sure we remind her.
Well, no, but that is important. Why not? Why not? In all seriousness, why not? Why can't Taylor Swift understand that for her legion of fans that are all incredibly young, that their future is reliant on a stable Earth? Why can't that be the case? Why can't she write a song that is about the health of the planet? Why can't, when she does her concerts, make them 100% sustainable? Why can't she have an advocate for climate? Why not?
That's a good question.
She represents so many millions upon millions of young people, and their future relies on a healthy planet. I would actually say that it is her responsibility to do that.
Well, we're running out of time. I just want to end with a question, if you don't mind. If there was someone at some point in history that you could go back to and tell them what you know today, that could hopefully change the course of history in some meaningful way regarding climate change, is there someone at some point in history that you feel, if you had a chance to go back in time and speak to this person and say, hey, do you know what we know in 2024? You should be involved in this in some way. Is there anyone that you think could be a useful, but just one person, like not a whole group of people, just one person?
Well, what I would say in answer to that is that maybe we haven't met that person yet. Rather than thinking in a sort of defeatist attitude that we should go back in time and meet some influential politician or influential big business leader that has incredible power and influence, and please say, well, if you had changed your policy, your life, then we wouldn't be in this situation. Climate change is a problem, but we can adapt.
Okay.
I need to meet the next person that can change planet Earth.
Okay.
That's what needs to happen. So I haven't met them yet. I would say that there still is this time.
Okay.
And so maybe it will be someone on this podcast, some person who is going to incorporate great wealth and influence, or somebody who's going to take on the responsibility of millions of people on planet Earth who goes, right,
we need to get this done.
We need to get this done, and I know how to do it.
Right.
And that's what I would say about that. Going back through time, that's gone.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
History is to learn from, but we can't change it. We change our future.
Thank you. That's a great way to end off. Thanks, Ben. We really enjoyed this, and I hope really that this message sounds the alarm for many people, whether they are at senior levels or at individual levels, because we do have power as individuals collectively to basically say, look, we want this. And whatever you have been thinking about as a government, what you've been looking at, are all the short-term problems. But now we need to look at the long-term problem that is overarching, and everything sits on this. You can solve all these short-term problems and we'll still be in trouble. So I hope that maybe this could be another piece of the puzzle that we need.
I just think we need to realize that the power of the individual in their voice. So if you're a young person, ask your guardian or parent, what are we doing about climate change, sustainability? If you're the head of the household, what are you doing in the community about climate change and sustainability? If you're an employee, ask your employer. If you're in a democracy, ask your elected official.
Right.
The world is not in a good state right now. We see regional wars. We've had outbreaks of pandemics. But what's the underlying of all of this is a healthy environment. We solve planet Earth. You won't have regional wars. You won't have pandemics. You will have a healthy, prosperous society. And that's what we all want. Solving climate change, if we could be a society that comes together and solves climate change, we will be a lot happier, we'll be a lot healthier, we'll have removed a lot of the inequality, we'll be better human beings. So why not do that?
Agreed. Thank you so much, Ben. We've come to the end of the time we have, and it's been a great pleasure to have you today. Thank you so much.